This special edition is to discuss the chaotic, hard to predict, hard to understand Tez Walker eligibility, or better said, ineligibility case at UNC. The Kent State transfer, formerly of North Carolina Central, has been deemed ineligible by the NCAA. UNC coach Mack Brown, UNC athletic director Bubba Cunningham have put out pretty strongly worded statements criticizing the NCAA. Earlier today, the NCAA snapped back with a strongly worded statement of its own. Here to discuss with me is Brian Davis, the founder of BD Educational Consulting. He has worked in college athletics for a long time, including at UNC, the University of Texas, and elsewhere. Brian, welcome. Good to see you. How are you?
Thank you. Good to see you, and I'm fine.
What is your starting point with the Tez Walker story? Are you at all surprised that this young man is caught up in the bureaucratic red tape of the NCAA? And what is your expectation for where this will go from here?
I'll answer that in reverse. I don't know that I have an expectation because you can't. You hit the nail on the head in the introduction. It's hard to predict. And the thing that I know over my 3.5 decades of working either on campus as an administrator and an academic counselor and an associate AD, or now I dip my toe in other people's athletic departments to help them with certain things. It's all unpredictable because the NCAA rules and their application of those rules is always fluid. And the first time I saw Tez Walker, I will say this, I was at UNC's practice and I was there to talk to a couple of Max staff members, not coaching staff, but part of that ecosystem of the program, to get their take on some things I was working on in the tech space. And I was standing next to Mac, and this kid runs by and runs a deep route, and I was like, who's that guy? I mean, he wasn't on the team last year because he's tall and pretty and fast. And he said, that's Tez Walker, the student athlete that just transferred from Kent State. And I said, man, that's awesome. I'm going to look forward to him. I was a former track guy, so I can recognize. I don't know that much about football, but I know fast people. So when it basically became public or put in the public conversation in August that this was an issue, I texted Mac, who I worked with for 26 years, and just reminded him that there are some, we've had some experience, particularly when we were at Texas, with a couple of eligibility waiver issues, and they were completely unpredictable. And one I thought was a slam dunk was denied, and one I thought had no chance to be approved was approved. So there's no logic behind it. And what we like to talk about the NCAA as if it's this giant, it is a giant organization, but its lack of consistency is pretty obvious. And that's because these committees are made up of members, schools, staff members. Yeah. So for instance, when I was at Texas, I had one of my academic counselors serve on, I nominated him to serve on a committee for special consideration for students with learning differences that may be having, negative impacts from progress towards degree rules. It was a great opportunity for that young man to build his resume and those kinds of things. And there are people that work in college athletics that probably spend more time on those committees than they do on their own campuses.
One thing I've said from my legal background is it's usually less complicated to win on the facts at the beginning, and it's usually harder to win on appeal. And I think this is being proven true in the Tez Walker case. One question for you, given your decades in college athletics, what can you share about how rules are adopted? Because one thing I remind fans of, when they criticize the NCAA, most of the time fans have no idea whom they're criticizing.
Right.
They don't even realize that their own school either was directly involved in adopting that rule that just came back to haunt their own guy, or was indirectly involved in adopting the rule that came back to haunt their own guy.
Right.
So let's be real about this. UNC was involved in the process
yes.
of crafting the rule that is now haunting Tez Walker.
Right.
My question to you is, in that process, and I remember going through these drills in law school, and they were hard because you had to try to anticipate every possible variation. And that's a challenge, even for smart people.
Sure.
So when they adopted this, I know they adopted it back in January under a very harsh, we're tired of multiple transfers directive.
Right.
Even Mac Brown said that. So
Yes.
that can't be a surprise to anybody.
No, not at all.
Why in the original adoption of the language did they not contemplate, say, discounting any COVID-related transfer? One clause.
Right.
If one of your transfers was related to COVID, it doesn't count for purposes of one sentence would have prevented 9 months of angst over Tez Walker. Or you could have said, given the chaotic COVID circumstances, of the once a century pandemic,
right,
only transfers from 2021, from fall of 2021 forward count as transfers. You could have said that.
Sure.
Just like they said they were going to grant everybody a free year of eligibility. If they wrote that one sentence, there would be no Tez Walker complication here. What do you know about that crafting process? Because to me, the unfairness, they dropped the ball on Tez Walker in January, infinitely more than they have dropped the ball on Tez Walker in this appeals process.
Well, I think what we have to be mindful of is that when the rules are changed, or a new rule is to be put in place, and it has to be voted on by, they've reduced it from the entire membership to, committees and D1 council, those kinds of things. The application of that rule change is where I see the inconsistencies. I'll give you a better example from my experience when the academic progress rate was enacted in 2003, 2004. The original thought was, we're going to come up with this metric of academic progress, of retention and graduation and so on and so forth. And they said the first year we will not exact any penalties upon any schools that don't meet these benchmarks. They changed their mind in midstream. I guess I'm mixing metaphors. They changed the horse in midstream, right? Yeah. They decided, no, you know what? We're going to go ahead and impose these penalties. And then they came back a year later and said, okay, now we're putting a new layer on here that says if you transfer eligible, you don't get the retention point back to your original school if you don't have at least a 2.6 GPA. I mean, it's completely arbitrary as far as I'm concerned. I have no doubt that faculty, athletic reps, presidents, people from academia put some data together and said, oh, this would be appropriate. The salient point is that those people with boots on the ground don't necessarily get the information they need about how these things are going to be applied. I have no idea what the conversations were in January on UNC's campus or anywhere else. When you talked about your legal background, we would, with that logic, you would say, okay, this student athlete transferred on January 10th, 12th, 16th, whenever he was enrolled, whenever he matriculated to UNC's campus, under the idea that he was going to be eligible, because prior to that, that's how it worked. And then a few days, a week, whatever it was later, the D1 Council approved this rule change. Yep. It is conceivable to me that compliance officers, athletic directors, administrators weren't necessarily given any kind of guidelines about how they were supposed to approach this. And sometimes that can get kicked down the road for a while. So I'd be hesitant to say that somebody dropped the ball not knowing what the rules of engagement were. We knew what the rule was, but is it going to be grandfathered back to people who have already enrolled? And I have no doubt that Tez transferred in good faith, understanding he'd be eligible because that's what the rule been, and that's what the coaches were thinking.
Yeah, I wouldn't accuse anybody at UNC of dropping the ball, but I absolutely would not hesitate to accuse somebody at the NCAA of dropping the ball. If
Well,
there's not a lawyer in the room on January 10th, you're doing it wrong.
right,
Period.
right,
End of discussion. Because by January 10th, as people are signing off, anybody in academia knows that many universities have started their new semester.
right,
It does not take a rocket scientist to realize that
right.
some people have started their new semester thinking that the old rules are still in effect. And now this person has relied on that, is a couple of days into his new semester, has uprooted his life. But nobody thought to add one sentence, anyone already enrolled at their new school prior to the inaction. That's insane to me. That's
Yes.
unacceptable to me. It's illogical. It's unprofessional. It's unacceptable from the NCAA.
Well,
My next question for you would be, what did you make, as someone who's been on the university side for a long time, of the very recent meeting where, the board of trustees is called in and Mac Brown's in there and the chancellor's in there, and ultimately they do not announce any action, but it was all about reviewing legal options,
right.
which gets really complicated because, I don't think UNC is allowed to provide a lawyer to Tez Walker at no charge. Otherwise, that might be an impermissible benefit.
Well, or that maybe that rule changed at some point and we were not made aware of it. First of all, I don't know that the Board of Trustees meeting was just about this issue. I'm sure they had a lot of other things on their plate. They had that tragic shooting and other issues. But I think for Tar Heel fans, I think they should feel good that people are sticking up for the campus. They're ready to fight for this individual student athlete. What Max said initially and what he's continued to say doesn't shock me in the least. And I think it's important to point out, he never once has said, this really hurts our offense. This really hurts our team. He has talked about that young man. And I worked with Mac for 26 years, and sometimes we clashed. We didn't always see eye to eye. But one reason we stayed together that long is I knew at the end of the day, his major concern was, the student athletes and their experience. So I was proud of the things he said about that. But in terms of not getting an announcement, I don't know what could have been resolved in that initial meeting. I think, and you probably know much better than I, when you talk about legal issues, it comes down to who has standing in some sort of civil issue. I don't know that the university can justify saying they have standing, or even the athletic department. The student athlete certainly does.
Sure.
And to your point, if he wanted to do something about it legally, I'm sure there are, tons of lawyers who'd be able to provide legal counsel and advice pro bono, but how he sets that up, that's a tough one.
How he sets it up would be tricky, because if somebody who was deemed to be a representative of UNC's athletic interests,
right,
was the one given free advice instead of fair market value advice, I mean, I wouldn't put past the NCAA to call that an impermissible benefit.
It would have to be somebody who graduated from Duke's Law School,
right?
To be able to,
right.
To
somebody who could not possibly be interpreted as a representative of UNC's athletic interests.
Absolutely.
Brian Davis is joining us here on the North Carolina Sports Network. What do you circle beyond what we've discussed as a popular misunderstanding about how the process works, or any misunderstandings about the details of the Tez Walker case? Because starting with the one we mentioned at the top, folks not understanding that their own schools are directly a part of adopting, crafting these rules.
Right.
It feels like half of what I see out there is misinformation.
Well, some of that misinformation may be intentional, and I'm going to try to choose my words wisely here. But information coming from the NCAA comes from their communications office, and they have a certain nomenclature. They have a certain way of saying this is what the NCAA does, as is its representative of every school, of every coach, of every student athlete. And we talk about the NCAA committee. Well, to your point, those committees are made up of employees of member institutions. And that's a thing that I don't think gets talked about enough. And I will say this, most journalists don't want to talk about it because it's complicated. And while they have the cognitive bandwidth to go through it, sometimes our readership or our viewership, their eyes kind of glaze over on complicated things. True. So it's hard to nail that down. I think there are two things here, and I don't want to change subjects and go into NIL, but two things have happened in the last couple of years: the NIL issue and the transfer portal. They are alike in that the NCAA governance punted on both of those issues. It became the Wild West, and they let the genie out of the bottle. Now they're trying to put the genie at least partway back in the bottle with eliminating the 2-year or the 2 transfer student athletes from being immediately eligible. I think it's a logical, rational thing to do. But again, we're changing the rule in the middle of the rule, if that makes sense.
One quick add to that. I actually think both sides have purposely stated things that they knew were misleading. Because, for example, Bubba Cunningham, somebody that I like, admire, respect, he threw out in his angry statement criticizing the NCAA, hey, how can you have a quarterback at 4 different schools in 6 years? And how can you have a university with 50 different transfers? What Bubba is doing there, just to be clear to everybody, and this is not in my opinion, this is flat fact, whether Bubba wants to hear it or not. He used 2 examples that have absolutely nothing to do with the Tez Walker situation, and I'll briefly explain why. The guy who's been a quarterback at 4 different schools in 6 years, that's an accurate description by Bubba Cunningham, was a graduate of the University of Georgia. So a guy named JT Daniels was at Southern Cal. He transfers to Georgia. That's his one free transfer.
Right.
He got his diploma from Georgia. Once you have your diploma, you are free under current NCAA rules.
Yes.
So by the time he goes to West Virginia, school number 3, and he's now at Rice, school number 4, he was a graduate transfer in the 3rd and 4th schools. Nothing against the rules. Nothing against the rules. So Bubba's example was extremely misleading. He's trying to win the court of public opinion. He's trying to say, well, that sounds crazy, but it's legal. But this sounds like it should be legal, and it's not. I understand where he's coming from, but it is literally 100% irrelevant to the rules as applied to the Tez Walker case. Tez is not a grad transfer, period.
Right.
And JT Daniels is a grad transfer, period. And the membership schools debated, how should we handle grad transfers? Oh, they get to go wherever they want. They can keep transferring. Storm Duck actually left the Tar Heels, transferred to Penn State, changed his mind during spring practice and switched to Louisville. People are screaming, how can you go to 3 different schools in 6 years? Well, he's a grad transfer. Right. The NCAA membership decided, including UNC, that grad transfers get treated one way, undergrad transfers like Tez Walker get treated a different way. So I wanted to squeeze that in because lots of folks have no idea that Bubba's 2 examples, Colorado had to sign 50 guys under the rules. There are no guys like Tez Walker on Colorado's roster. There just aren't. So that was public posturing by Bubba, with all due respect. Literally irrelevant. Literally 100% irrelevant on the Tez Walker case. But he's arguing in the public forum about fairness.
Right.
And it does seem unfair to Tez Walker. I just think the unfairness, again, traces to the writing of the January rules. And if he has a lawsuit, by the way, to me, maybe the only strong point of a lawsuit for Tez Walker, if it comes to that, is that he was enrolled at Carolina before they changed the rules. That in the legal world is a pretty big deal. It's called ex post facto in various contexts. And it's a problem. If you and I were caught speeding and the penalty was $50 at the time we got caught speeding, and then a month later they jacked up the penalty to $500, we would only get charged the $50 because that's what the penalty was when we got caught. Not not by the time it was applied. So there's an argument there. I just know that courts, maybe in your experience as well, tend to be deferential to the organization.
Well, courts are based on law. I mean, codified law that says this is how it is. The NCAA rules are fairly clear, but every time there's a new rule, it seems like it takes several iterations of various scenarios before they kind of nail down this is how we're going to do it. And I think Tez, unfortunately, along with his teammates and all the fans, are kind of caught up in that lack of consistency. It's not intentional, but it's there. I mean, they have to find a way to be more consistent with it. And there are examples throughout, the modern NCAA era, that would address that, where the rules were, intended to do this, but they did something completely different.
Where should fans look next, in your opinion? Because it feels to me that Tez Walker's chances are very slim. And even if he goes to court, one thing that I do know about the legal process as it applies to the NCAA, some people envision if we just get this crazy set of facts in front of a judge, the judge will just say, this is unfair, and he or she will overturn it. It doesn't work that way. The judge doesn't get to impose his or her own view of fairness. It just doesn't work that way.
Right.
Did the NCAA follow their own rules? Did the NCAA adopt arbitrary and capricious rules? Or did the NCAA violate this young man's constitutional rights or some other legal right? It's just not as simple as a judge is not allowed to put his or her own eyeballs on a set of facts and say, oh, I think this should be the result. It just doesn't work that way. Most people wish it did work that way.
Right.
It's way harder than that. And that's why I wish I could give Tez Walker more optimism, but I just don't see it.
Well, I come at this from a lens of, 35 years in athletic academic support, where, my hope was that every one of those student athletes who came to campus thinking that their sport was going to be the thing that led them to the promised land, I always called it the light coming on. At some point, the light comes on and you go, you know what? Here I am at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. I have a wonderful opportunity to get an incredible academic degree. And so I think, is it disappointing? Of course it is. It's horrible. But it's a hurdle that can be overcome, and he has an opportunity to progress towards his degree, play next year. As far as I can tell, he's got eligibility next year, and walk out of Chapel Hill with an opportunity to get drafted by the NFL with a degree in his pocket. I think that's a great goal. That's a great thing to look forward to. From my perspective, I think the thing that I have a pretty good sense that Coach Brown doesn't want this to be a distraction anymore, and that it's time to focus on the team we do have and work towards, the team goals. Support the young man, support his family, do everything you can, but it's time to make sure that every one of those young men in the locker room are focused on, the next opponent, and the next opponent, and the next opponent, taking care of their business. So,
last thing for Brian Davis joining us. He's the founder of BD Educational Consulting. He has worked at UNC, worked at Texas and other places during his time in college athletics. Your understanding of the way these compliance issues work. I was surprised to learn that Tez Walker, the weekend before he visited UNC, so last December, he's announced he's leaving Kent State. Nowadays you enter your name in the transfer portal. Mm-hmm. He has an official visit scheduled for the Tar Heels right in the middle of December, and of course does end up committing to UNC at that point. It's a matter of public record that he actually visited Rutgers the week before. Mm-hmm. And if the NCAA is skeptical about, and for my purposes of my own mental health, I need to be near my family in Charlotte, North Carolina, I wonder how much back and forth there is, or how much availability there is if I were simply a truth seeker, I had no dog in the hunt, as the old saying goes, I absolutely positively would ask Tez Walker, hey, if it was really about your mental health, and Charlotte, your hometown, of course, is 2 hours and change away from Chapel Hill, North Carolina, that part makes sense. But you visited Rutgers, which is 600 miles away. It's even farther away than Kent State is from your family in Charlotte, North Carolina. For someone saying this is really fundamentally about mental health, I wonder if there's an opportunity for an exchange back and forth. Because if I'm the NCAA, I'm asking that question unapologetically while I'm also reading these medical documents from those at Kent State and those at UNC who have some kind of a mental health plan for Tez Walker. But to me, it's not irrelevant because it goes to whether this is really just a good old-fashioned transfer for somebody who's trying to look for a loophole on mental health. If you were thinking of going to Rutgers and even talking to Pitt and Penn State about visiting their schools.
Well, here are the nuances that I hope I can articulate. First of all, we know that he wanted to get out of Kent State for whatever, coach change, whatever. Once you're in the portal, there's a really good chance that your former coaches say, see ya, good luck. All right, you're not coming back. We got to replace you. I'm sure there are times when coaches lobby young men to take themselves out of the portal. We see that a little bit. But once you're in the portal, you're in sort of purgatory because you haven't been able to have somebody at UNC review your transcript to make sure that you meet progress towards degree regulations on a new campus. You could have a 4.0 at any school in the country and struggle to get all of the credit hours that you've earned accepted by another school. So that's the thing about the transfer portal nobody likes to talk about publicly is the fact that 40% of the kids who entered in the last 3 years never found a second home. That's not an anomaly. That's a huge problem, right? And I would attribute most of it to the fact that they're not given a chance to find out before they get in the portal what their transfer looks like from an academic standpoint. So if and I'm speculating here, if Tez puts himself in the portal, the first folks that want him to visit are Rutgers. Well, he's going to go. I'm going to check this out. So there's so many unknowns for these kids. It's not like free agency in professional sports. Everybody tries to attribute it to it. It's not. The other thing I want to say from an academic counselor and personal counseling standpoint is that the mental health thing is real. It's important, but it's such a huge umbrella that covers so many different things. I mean, a lot of kids are now being brave enough to talk about anxiety. It's not new. Student athletes have always had that. Students have always had that. Everybody has that. But the fact that they have the courage to come forward. In my years working with student athletes, it was hard to get somebody convinced that they needed to see an outside counselor to kind of wrap their head around some of these stress points. I couldn't do it. My staff couldn't do it because we were too close to the coaches. We're too close to the campus. They needed to go outside to do that. It was a very difficult thing to do because it showed weakness in their minds. I think it's really brave of these folks to do that. We don't know really what the mental health issues were in terms of the level of care required. Sometimes just a change of scenery can help with that. And we probably everybody has our own individual experiences with that kind of thing. So, I understand what you're saying about things that needed to be asked, but I think, it's fairly clear that the young man transferred to UNC. He did it before the rule change. They changed the rule. And I'm, again, speculating. There was a considerable amount of time, months, where the NCAA didn't provide the kind of education to the compliance offices about what they needed to do for those kinds of appeals. So
I think that's a good bottom line. And I think that might be the only place for Tez Walker to end up hanging his hat legally if he does. The timetable matters. And for those who don't know, part of the request for a waiver does include Tez doesn't have to answer these questions publicly, nor should he. His mental health is his business, and
Yes,
he owes us
100%.
nothing. But the NCAA does demand documentation from Kent State
Sure.
about the disruption of his daily routine, and they use specific phrases about how it severely impacted his day-to-day life. But he has some tricky hurdles to get through, because he said he was leaving 2 days after his coach said he was leaving. And
Yep.
a coaching change is not an acceptable reason for a waiver.
Right.
And also the Rutgers trip could be a complication as well. But I think you've helped us bottom line this, Brian. Thank you for the time here on the North Carolina Sports Network.
My pleasure, David. Great seeing you.
Learn more, everybody. We're writing about this. You can find our video at the website, our audio at the website, my articles and others at the website. As always, that is ncsportsnetwork.com. Thanks for being with us.